Century Communications presents a public affairs special, Turning Back the Clock on the Environment. This is brought to you by the Coalition for Clean Air. Especially want to thank Linda Wade for putting it together, and GTE. Here are the facts. In Southern California, we have the worst air in the United States. Air pollution-induced asthma among children, that is, up to 12 years old, is the hospitalization, the greatest reason for a kid to be hospitalized is for asthma, and 15 to 20% of our children's lung capacity here in the basin is less than you would find in Seattle or San Francisco. As they're growing up, they're breathing this filthy air. In 1970, we had the Clean Air Act, and it forced all kinds of mandates here. At that time, 4 out of every 5 days, the air was unacceptable, totally unacceptable, unhealthy to breathe. Now it's 2 out of every 5 days. So there has been progress made. But those 2 days out of 5 are still 2 days out of 5. 2/3 of the pollution that we have here in the basin comes from cars and trucks and buses, and now the diesel engine is beginning to really pollute. And you business people, $9.4 billion is costing us in terms of health care needs and employment, sickness, and things like that. Very significant thing. This show is to talk about, has the clock been turning back with the new Congress and the politics in Sacramento and so on, and where do we go from here? Joining me are Ed Begley Jr. Good to have you, Ed. And you're a guy who practices what you preach. You live in a solar house and you have an electric car.
That's right.
That's great.
It works, too.
Glad to have you here with us. We also have on the panel Lynn Scarlett, Vice President of the Reason Foundation, Larry Berg, an environmental energy consultant, Cliff Gladstein, President of the Coalition for Clean Air, and Joel Reynolds, Senior Attorney, the Natural Resource Defense Council. Start with you, Larry. You've played politics over the years, and you've seen it all, and now the new Congress and the contract with America and the potential dismantling of the Clean Air Act. Is this true?
Yes, it is true. And I think one of the tragedies is that we have forgotten why it is that we had these so-called mandates in the first place. Why did we have rules regarding meat inspections? Because people got sick and people died. That's why. Why did we have a Clean Air Act? Because we had a health problem. The whole basis for the mandates is health. And before that, we had the voluntary approach, and it didn't work. And I would suggest that going back to that will produce the same results as we had prior to the time that we moved in the mid-60s for these kinds of legislation. We'll be right back where we started.
Well, Cliff, why is this going on that way? I mean, our health is the number one thing we can care about is our own self. Why is the clock turning back? Is it turning back?
I think that at best, we're going to be stagnant, and at worst, we're going to find that things are going to get worse. There are proposals that have been introduced by members of the leadership of this Congress to repeal all of the 1990 amendments of the Clean Air Act, amendments which are crucial, particularly here in California, not only to our environment, but also to our economy, because those are the amendments that push new technology, advanced vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, renewable energy, all of the things which not only affect our health, our environment, but also which provide us with the basis for new economic development. Very important in California.
I might add, those amendments were carried by Governor Wilson when he was United States Senator. Those very amendments. Governor Wilson and Tim Wirth carried the amendments to the 1990 Clean Air Act that dealt with the state of California, dealt with the alternative fuels issue, and dealt with the 20-year time span for the South Coast. Those were his amendments.
And what does this all mean? Lynn?
Well, I'm going to dive in and say that I beg to differ a little bit with the folks here. First of all, I think Larry is exaggerating. The contract with America, and more particularly what we're concerned about, which is regulatory reform as it relates to environment, is not about selling the environment down the road. What it is trying to do is to bring some common sense to some of those regulations. We're not talking about all or nothing. We're talking about making things better. Specifically, when we talk about risk regulation, or excuse me, risk reform, what that's doing is saying, look, we've got a lot of problems. Doesn't it make sense to try and identify the big things and go after those first? You've got cost-benefit reform. What that's all about, again, is what all of us practice in our everyday lives. It's about, gosh, if we have a problem, or lots of problems, don't we want to spend our money where we get the biggest bang for the buck? Don't we want to figure out what the biggest problems are, where we can get real benefits for those dollars spent? So I think it is an exaggeration to say that this is selling the environment down the road. On the other hand, I think that many environmental critics of this have been quite right to suggest that perhaps this blanket approach might indeed get us in a kind of a quagmire where all we do is debate whether the risk is this much higher than that, and so perhaps this blanket approach wasn't the way to go about this reform.
But Joe, isn't the real story our air and making it clean, and are we seeing an assault on our air?
Well, first, let me respond to Lynn, if I could. I mean, it all sounds great. If you call it reform, if you call it cost-benefit analysis, if you call it job creation and wage enhancement, who's against that? No one is.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that's not what's going on. It's a dismantling of our environmental laws, not just the Clean Air Act, but the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Superfund Act, the Endangered Species Act, all the laws that protect our public lands. They are under affirmative assault. Let's just take one at a time. Regulatory reform. What that means is a euphemism for inserting some 22 additional analyses: cost-benefit, regulatory analysis, flexibility analysis, impact analysis, and some 60 new points at which industry can file lawsuits to block regulations. The bottom line there is we will not have regulations to protect the environment and the public health in this country because it will simply be impossible to get a regulation through. There's takings legislation, which for the first time in the history of this country would require the taxpayers to pay polluters not to pollute. We have an environmental system in this country that's based on the principle that the polluter pays. If you're going to pollute, then you've got to pay the cost. And the legislation in Congress is now going to transfer the entire cost of that burden to the taxpayer. The effective result of that is we can't afford environmental protection.
Ed, you're a citizen activist besides an actor. How is this happening all of a sudden? I mean, the environment, we've been making progress. I just went from 4 days of bad air out of 5 to 2. Great progress. And we know the kids' lungs, 15 to 20% of their lung capacity isn't developed or destroyed here. How do you understand this in a political sense?
What's frustrating about it for me is that we see these things that are working. We know that natural gas vehicles are much cleaner than gasoline or diesel or many other fuels, but there's no real move forward, as we had hoped, from Detroit and from other fuel companies that were going to have infrastructure so people could fuel them, so people could buy original equipment manufacturer, they could buy OEM equipment. That suddenly is all vaporized in front of us. Electric vehicles, the ZEV mandate is now threatened, so that's frustrating to see that happen. But let's put a face on what you're saying. What you're saying is true. 15% of the kids' lung capacity that live here in the basin is diminished and destroyed. There was a kid in Seattle who sadly, met an untimely end there. He was a teenager, and there was no ID on the kid. Well, they quickly surmised she was from Los Angeles when they did an autopsy and looked at her lungs. They knew she was from LA. What kind of legacy is that? We have seen regulations that have worked for stationary sources and mobile sources. It was purported to be the end of business in Los Angeles, and we did what we're going to do in stationary sources. Smog check was going to be the end of commerce in this state. Well, it didn't work out that way. Made people want to stay here and work here and do business here. And I think these regulations are good, and we shouldn't go back. We don't have air that is too clean. We don't have water that is too pristine. Why would we roll back?
Now, Mayor Reardon appointed you to a commission on the environment for the city of Los Angeles. What are your responsibilities in that?
Well, the responsibilities of the Environmental Affairs Department are vast, and I'm one of the commissioners for that department. We deal with solid waste issues. The toxic issues have been now merged into into our domain, and there's green jobs, there's energy efficiency, recycling, there's lots of stuff, that we're doing. We have a new program with brownfields. We're trying to get these brownfields, these abandoned lots, turned into community gardens and what have you. There's a million things. We're trying to have some streamlining of our own, and I think streamlining and regulatory reform, real regulatory reform is good. Why should people go through all this red tape? Why can't they get these permits in a swift fashion, not have to go to City Hall? Why can't they telecommute from the valley and get their permits, air permits and what have you, rather than going to Diamond Bar? We're doing stuff like that that is real regulatory reform.
This recycling business, I've heard complaints about it, that you put your cans in the one thing and your glass in the snack, but by the time the garbage men come by, it's already gone by other people. Is the city losing money on this program?
Yeah, they're losing money. I would certainly look the other way. If there's a homeless person coming by with a shopping cart and picking it up, that's not what's happening for the most part. It's people, a highly orchestrated business with people in vehicles, kind of nice ones. I'm going to start videotaping them, coming by and pilfering this stuff. The newspaper is very expensive now. They're taking that, they're taking the aluminum, and the other stuff that...
So they're taking it to recycle it.
They're taking it to recycle
Yeah,
it.
that's good then.
Yeah, that's good. That part of it's
There's
good.
a
But
market. There's such the price for paper and the price for these goods is so elevated that there's an incentive for people to go around and steal from the city, so to speak. But it's being recycled.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that this actually, recycling is something of a success story, and pointing to the scavenging and looking for one more sort of boogeyman in the environmental arena, I think, is misplaced. The reason we have scavenging is precisely because of the success of recycling. We've seen the scrap value of old newsprint go up 5-fold in 1 year. So let's let's not look at ogres where we find them. But I want to return, if I could, to some of the comments that have been made, being sort of the odd one out here.
Please do.
I think we have to unpack the discussion a little bit and ask, why is it that some folks have pressed for environmental reform and regulatory reform? As Ed Begley himself suggested, there is some room here. A Superfund, widely acknowledged that Superfund in its present formulation needs some fixing. When you have a law that in some instances 80 cents on the dollar is going to lawyers and not cleanup, that needs fixing. We're not talking about making the businesses richer here. We're talking about health. We're talking about getting those dollars to clean up sites and have a better world, if you will. I would suggest just one more example here, even on the air emission front, and let's remember that there's no likely successful move afoot to completely repeal the Clean Air Act. But when you have air emission regulations that say target wood preservatives and the volatile organic compounds that are coming out of wood preservatives, minuscule emissions, but at the same time you've still got tons of emissions coming from vehicles. This suggests to me that you've got some priority setting to do, and that's what regulatory reform is partly about.
Let's define minuscule. If my recollection, and I happen to have voted for those regulations on the AQMD, and at the time, they were one of the largest sources of reactive organic gas, or VOC, emissions of any source in this basin, the furniture manufacturers. It's not a minuscule amount. And if we think about it a minute, not only was that regulation passed, it was delayed because the technology didn't move. I don't think you need to rewrite things to have common sense reform. If a technology doesn't work, you can delay it. The present board just delayed it again. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but the point is we need reform, but let's don't throw the whole thing out.
Well, let's talk about that. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, there is something very major looming in California that talks about 1998, where we should have 2% of our automobiles with zero emission, meaning electric cars. Since the automobile is one of the biggest polluter, we're going to talk about that when we come back. We'll be right back.
The Earth is in a race with global warming, and the Earth is losing. Together, we have the power to fight global warming by demanding more fuel-efficient cars. Contact the Sierra Club.
Welcome back. Zero emissions, that is a standard that California said by the year 1998, 2% of the new vehicles have to be zero emission. And then it gradually goes up until a significant amount of our automobiles would be electric cars. Ed, you have an electric car. How long have you had an electric car?
I've been driving them off and on since 1970, exclusively for the past 5.5 years. That's why it's kind of frustrating to hear that they don't work. I bought an electric car for $12,000. It works great. A guy made a profit on it, doing it one at a time. It's a kind of a handmade electric car, so it's not something that's mass-produced. You could make a greater profit on. Works great, gets me around town. The combination of electric vehicles for around-town trips, short distances, which are 90% of our trips, and natural gas for long range, we have our transportation needs net.
How many miles can you go on one electric charge?
You can go 55 miles in my $12,000 car. The more expensive ones, the fancier ones, you know, you can go 100 miles, what have you, but a very inexpensive electric car, anyone will take you 55, 60 miles today.
So then usually a day you're running around with it, then at night you plug it in?
Plug it in. Nighttime is a very good time to use power. It's very efficient. Also, you know, you're going to make pollution generating the power because you're going to burn some sort of fuel to do that.
Right.
But also, it's much easier to contain emissions on one smokestack than it is a million tailpipes. Also, use 25% of your gasoline in a city like LA, any big city, stopped. You're not going anywhere. So all those things, all those efficiencies combined, it's 95% less pollution, figuring the generation of the fuel and the power and what have you. But mine is 100% less because I use solar to charge my car, so it really is less.
Wow, and Larry, you were alluding to then Senator Pete Wilson in Washington did this, that, and the other, but now we have Governor Pete Wilson and presidential candidate Pete Wilson, and we know the automobile manufacturers and the oil companies are trying to stop this. Is it happening, and do you expect 1998 to be 2%?
Let me answer this way. I get asked this question. I have seen nothing that he has said to indicate to me that he is going to change. Now, I know he's been attacked. I think it's in his political interest not to change that ZEV. And I think what we ought to be doing, if we're concerned about the ZEV, is convincing him that if he goes anywhere in national politics, he's got to win California. And if he repeals the ZEV, it's going to cause him political problems in California. I know his nominee to be chair of the Air Resources Board is a good person who believes in this sort of thing, and I think we ought to be supporting the governor because I've seen no evidence that he's going to repeal it. Now, that does not mean there won't be some changes. I think that the hybrid change they've suggested is a good one. I'm involved in fuel cells, in which you'll have another category between ultra-low emission and ZEVs. And I happen to think that that is an appropriate change. It's a response to technology. It may very well be that the natural gas vehicles, the dedicated, may very well hit that level as opposed to ULEV. So that's the kind of thing I would like to see us do to regulations. Don't throw them out. Let's make them work. Some of them work and some of them don't. But to argue that somehow this is a mandate, the real issue here is money. It's money when 20% of the cars no longer use gasoline. That's money from petroleums. That's the bottom line issue.
Cliff?
Yes, sir.
So take it to the next level, the politics of this. Are we going to be able to keep what he's saying they're going?
I think Larry is right about Governor Wilson. I don't think that it's in his political interest to repeal the ZEV measure because of the issue that was raised in the earlier segment about what regulations and what laws are pushing the right sort of technology in the right direction, not only for California, but for our country and for our planet. When you look at what the major cause of air pollution and most pollution is in the world today, it's the fact that we are so reliant on carbon-based fuels. And the more that we push technology in the direction of hydrogen-based fuels, the quicker we will bring tomorrow to us. And that's the sort of thing that the ZEV mandate, the LEV-ZEV program, brings to California and brings to the rest of the world. It's not only essential for our society, it's essential for planetary society as well.
And what's happening on this program is just one example of what's going on in Washington. It's not driven by environmental reform. You know, when Congress passes a law that says that the government can't regulate cryptosporidium in drinking water, can't regulate arsenic in drinking water, can't regulate lead poisoning, which is the #1 environmental health hazard for children in the country, can't regulate radon in drinking water, can't regulate sewage from cities like Los Angeles, can no longer promulgate any new water quality standards under the Clean Water Act.
What is government for?
What's government for? Exactly. We live in California, we live in Los Angeles because the quality of life here is good. And an important part of that is the environment that we live in.
What is Bob Dole talking about?
Bob Dole is responsible for two major pieces of this legislation. One is the so-called regulatory reform, which is nothing less than paralysis by analysis of the federal government. We will not see new regulations. The second is the Dole Takings Bill, which basically means having the taxpayers now pay oil companies, mining companies, paper companies not to pollute. We're citizens. We have to comply with the law in this country. Nobody pays us to comply with the law. Why should polluters in this country, industry in this country, have a welfare program set up for them? At the same time, we're cutting off home heating oil for old people in the Northeast. At the same time, we're cutting off school lunch programs. It's absolutely unbelievable what's going on, and the problem is that the public doesn't really understand it yet.
Lynn, how about that?
Well, I think there's a lot there. Let me make one thing clear. I think absolutely we all care about the environment. We want to see a better environment.
Yeah.
But again, I think you've mischaracterized. Let's take the takings clause. What this is about is saying if you are asked, if you have a piece of property, for example, and that is identified as a piece of property that has an endangered species on it, and you're asked to set aside that property, not develop it, set it aside to preserve that species, that you ought to be compensated. Well, I would suggest that this is a little bit like we have other public goods and public amenities. When we ask somebody to set aside their property to put a school on that property, we compensate them to the degree. And this doesn't necessarily apply to all the circumstances you're saying, but to the degree we're asking the little guy, the little farmer, the little small property owner, to actually provide a public good for the rest of us, amenity values, old growth trees and so on, I think they indeed deserve that compensation. We as taxpayers should pay for that public good.
And under the law right now, there's the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. And it's
exactly
interesting,
right.
it's not the little guy that's pushing this.
They don't own all
It's
the trees.
big business that's pushing this. It's developers. It's oil companies. It's all the industrial polluters that I've already mentioned.
In fact,
they're the
that's
ones
not-
that are pushing this so-called revolution in Congress, and they stand to make big money off of it.
Point of correction. In fact, the environmental community itself actually did a survey of who was behind some of this stuff, and they came back somewhat disappointed to find that indeed there was a grassroots movement. But I think, you know, we need to get away from black and white on these issues, and I think all of us can agree on that what we do want is a better environment. The question is, how do we do that the best that we possibly
Okay, but saying
can?
that, isn't our environment, though, so assaulted and threatened? And I'm not, you know, an expert, but the weather has changed dramatically. You know, it's been so hot in the Midwest and in the East, and then they have so much rain in Florida, and then they have all these hurricanes coming in. Could we not say that some of the abnormalities in the weather is caused by either the greenhouse effect or the warming
Franklin
effect?
Nutter, the head of the Reinsurance Association of America, gets up and says, we are concerned, you know there's something changing with world weather. They're saying, what is going on? These are the people that insure big companies like Aetna and Mutual and what have you. When Franklin Nutter made a speech recently at a convention saying something very different is happening in world weather patterns, when we see the amphibians around the world dying, many species of amphibian dying off, why are they dying? Is it acid rain? Is it increased UVB from ozone depletion? Is it some beginning of global warming? We don't know that, but we know that they are dying. We know that the coral reefs are dying. These are the canary in the mine that are signaling us that something is wrong. You'd think we want to put on the brakes, not leave people shivering in the cold, but be more efficient and stop our over-dependence on the Carboniferous period. You know, it's kind of crazy.
Well, this brings us back to the vehicle issue, and in fact, I think that's an important, the ZEV mandate is an important, I do call it a mandate. What's wrong with that mandate? I would suggest to you two things. One is that it actually is going after, you know, people who are buying new cars. Well, new cars are already extremely clean. By the same token, you've got a whole lot of cars. I'm chairing California's Inspection and Maintenance Committee, trying to figure out how we're going to test old cars. You've got about 10% of the cars on the road out there
But Cliff is
that account
shaking his
for
head.
Yeah, and the
50,
problem with that,
60%
and Larry knows
emissions.
this quite well, is the problem with that, Lynn, is that in Southern California, we will not have clean air unless we have zero-emission vehicles. I mean, every single model demonstrates
The
that.
emission numbers
As clean
don't-
as we can get vehicles through inspection and maintenance programs, and as clean as we can get 1995 and 1996 models using reformulated gasoline, it's not enough. It's
That
not
depends-
enough to bring clean air to Southern
depends
California.
I would suggest some narrow assumptions. What I would much rather see, because I think it allows for an explosion of innovation, including, by the way, zero-emission vehicles, which is part of the picture, would be to introduce something like congestion pricing on our roadways. That is, we have used our roads thinking they're free. Go up and down, drive as many times as we want all by ourselves down the roadway. You begin to charge for road use.
Let me say that. If you say
People will
charge
change-
for, yeah, well, people will change for what, though? If they can't go in their car, they don't have any decent mass transit in this area here, how else are they going to get around?
They'll
have
do,
no options.
well,
They have no options.
they'll do, one of the other things that we're suggesting to couple with that is actually the advent of significant use of shuttle van service door to door, because people do want to go door to door.
Using alternative fuels.
And they could use, and in fact, interestingly enough, shuttle vans are actually a very good vehicle for alternative fuels.
That's right.
So we would
It's
argue,
creative ideas like that are not going to happen in this climate. You know, you mentioned the vehicle inspection and maintenance program. Under the EPA appropriation bill just passed by Congress, there's no funding for that. That program is gone.
Specifically prohibits it.
That's right. And the same thing is going to happen with the ZEV mandate. Your idea about this jitney service, which is a very good idea, there's not going to be any money for that, because that's a sensible program
Help
for the
me out with
environment.
this. They're burying in the ground and they're creating this subway. It's costing an incredible amount of money to make it. Why not just take our existing road system, put buses on that are either zero emission or natural fuel, and make it convenient for us every 15 minutes have a bus at a bus stop?
That was a political decision,
but this is in fact one of our points, is
What do
that
you
we
mean?
are
Excuse me, let me
misspending
interrupt you.
money.
What's the political decision on that? Go ahead.
Well, the decision to create a rail system for Southern California was based on just trying to do large capital projects to placate certain constituencies in Southern California and to create jobs. It makes no sense from a transportation or air quality perspective.
What would make sense?
Buses, but jitney services, like Lynn was suggesting, a decentralized system that could serve the decentralized Southern California. We have lots of work nodes in Southern California. We need transportation services that can go down our residential streets and serve those customers. We need more buses, more natural gas buses, more electric buses, more fuel cell buses servicing the transportation needs of Southern California. The MTA has the second largest bus fleet in the entire country. It's also the dirtiest vehicle fleet in Southern California. Those buses are at 30 grams a mile of NOx. It's outrageous. And now they're looking at an option to go back to diesel. They call it clean diesel, but it's still 2 times to 5 times as dirty
So why
as
don't
the
they go to
dirtiest
electric
natural
cars?
gas
Since Ed
buses.
is telling us he can have an electric car relatively inexpensive, and we could use it for those kinds of things.
Well, let's not rule out public transportation. I have, I guess, a minority view here about rail, but I want to say something about it. Yes, we should have electric trolley buses. Yes, we should have all those things and clean buses, all of that. But we're a big city. It's not like some little small health clinic you can get by with tongue depressors, some syringes. We need an MRI in this city. We also need a good rail system. And everybody's been saying this green line stinks. It doesn't go anywhere. Well, I rode from downtown right at the Omni Hotel to the airport, to a terminal at the airport, right into the airport with a little shuttle bus connection that is part of the system. I was there in an hour and it cost me $1.15. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with it is it costs you $1.15. It costs the taxpayer another bundle. These rail projects, and we've actually looked at them all around the country, and one of the problems you found is massive investment in rail, which goes from one point to another. That means it can't serve a lot of people, and it has not attracted new ridership. So you have a lot of money spent and very little reduction in your single car
As we say on
traveling.
television, to be continued. The half hour is up. I want to thank the 5 of you very much for this lively discussion, but to be continued, because the issue will continue until we do clean up our air. Thank you very much for coming, and I want to thank you out there for sharing your time with us. God bless you, and bye-bye.